In London. And Phil, going into the summit, the President and British Prime Minister David Cameron challenging their NATO allies not to get trapped in what they're calling isolationist policies. What are they saying about Russia and Ukraine?
Well, they are saying that the actions, what is happening in eastern Ukraine, is an example of brazen aggression from Russia. Now, that is something Moscow denies, but nevertheless, we have seen a number of things in recent days of social media, pictures being put out of suspected Russians inside eastern Ukraine. The 28 members of the NATO alliance have met today in Wales. This is top of their agenda, Ukraine, because it is believed by many that given the situation, this could be one of the most critical meetings of the NATO alliance since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Standing shoulder to shoulder in Wales, the 28 NATO member alliance have gathered for what some are calling their most important summit since the end of the Cold War.
Our NATO summit here in Wales will be one of the most important summits in the history of our alliance. A crucial summit at a crucial time.
NATO's first order of business, a show of solidarity with Ukraine as Western leaders, including the U.S., met on the first morning with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. Ukraine's importance was made abundantly clear in a joint op-ed issued a day earlier by President Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron that reads, in part, with Russia trying to force a sovereign state to abandon its right to democracy at the barrel of a gun, we should support Ukraine's right to determine its own democratic future and continue our efforts to enhance Ukrainian capabilities. Those tough words coming as talk of a ceasefire proposed by Russian President Vladimir Putin is met with skepticism.
What is actually happening on the ground, and we are still witnessing, unfortunately, Russian involvement in destabilizing the situation in eastern Ukraine.
The centerpiece of Putin's 7-point plan calls for pro-Russian separatists to end their military offensive in Donetsk and Luhansk, while Ukrainian forces would pull back from those areas and stop airstrikes. Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko said Wednesday he supported Russia's readiness to implement a plan that would lead to peace. He'll take that step Friday during talks with separatist leaders in Minsk. Before arriving in Wales, President Obama expressed his doubts about Russian-backed calls for peace in Ukraine.
We haven't seen a lot of follow-up on so-called announced ceasefires.
And while the president has stated he would not intervene militarily in Ukraine, U.S. soldiers will take part in training exercises in the country next week, marking the first time American troops have been on the ground there since the crisis began.
Citizens, like nations, will never settle for a world where the big are allowed to bully the small.
The photo.
Sooner or later, they fight back.
And those 28 leaders have had a photo opportunity. They've gotten together, what is normally called the family photo. This is the beginning of a 2-day summit, and it is interesting, I think symbolic to note, Del, that one of the very first things that we saw coming out of Wales here on the very first day of this summit was actually a meeting with the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who's also there, along with the major power players within NATO.
And Phil, as you mentioned, he has been there. He is now briefing NATO members. Tomorrow, those ceasefire negotiations involving Russia resume in Minsk. Does his presence in Wales send any type of message to Russia?
Oh, I think absolutely. It sends a very clear message that NATO is going to stand with Ukraine, at least in some capacity. Few expect any kind of actual military participation by NATO, but we could see military support for the government in Kiev. And clearly, this is something that is meant for the Kremlin to get its attention as to where the Western alliance stands. Del?
Phil Ittner for us live in London this morning. Phil, thank you very much.